Welcome to week 5 everyone. My name is Instructor Neville and I will be your guest lecturer for today. Last week we covered non-state actors and their impact upon states. Today we will be covering the use of force and terrorism. This week is particularly relevant for the news at the moment with the emphasis on terrorist groups. Now we have talked about power in the past, including the different types, but today we shall be focusing on military power. Realists would view this as fundamental, while liberals would say that it is more central, but it is at the very least the method of last resort. We must therefore study build-up and the ability to use military force. The goal of any use of this force is to provide security. Force itself can be defined as the use of violence or the threat of violence to achieve a political goal. The violence is what separates it from persuasion. We must also consider the threat of violence as the use of force. This therefore takes into account the build-up of military weapons and explains why there is so much emphasis placed upon military, while there is very rarely actual fighting. This is often referred to as coercion. Sometimes the threats are explicit and easy to spot. More often though, it is implied. In many instances, like with nuclear weapons, it is constantly in the background. It is the ability to destroy your opponent. This adds another layer to any negotiation, as if it does not work, there could be violence. On the other hand, the use of coercion is always an attempt to bargain, as they have not actually attacked yet. What it comes down to is the credibility of the threat. Credibility can be boiled down to the capability of a state to carry out a threat and the willingness to do so. Capability is fairly easy to measure. We can look at the size and strength of a military. We know how many nuclear weapons each state has, so generally speaking, a state with a bigger military will have more capability. What is harder to measure is the will to use force. Sometimes a state with much lower capabilities will have a much higher will to fight. We can look at the Vietnamese during the Vietnam War as an excellent example of this. So this will can also be defined as a willingness to suffer casualties. The force we have talked about so far would be considered aggressive, as it is trying to get your opponent to do what you want. But what about being able to resist against force? If a state can show that any attack against them would not work or backfire, then they can dramatically reduce the credibility of any act against them. There are two different ways to do this: defense and deterrence. Defense is the ability to repel an attack. This is the more traditional tactic, and we can see in the Great Wall of China and the castles in Europe, or the great ocean surrounding America. These make it far more difficult for another to invade. On the other hand, we have deterrence. A good defense can be difficult to build, and in the modern age it is almost impossible. So deterrence is when you try and prove to your opponent that the cost of an attack would be greater than any benefit that could be gained. This was at the heart of the Cold War, where any move by one would mean a devastating nuclear reaction by the other. Nuclear weapons are the best example of pure deterrence, as hopefully they will never have to be used. The much larger section, though, is a mix of the two, as most weapons can be used to defend a state, like a plane or a tank, but can also be used to increase the cost of any conflict. A problem for the international community is that weapons built for defense could be used for attack. So if a country builds ships to defend its coast, it could look like it is preparing to invade another. This confusion is known as the security dilemma. The difficulty comes from the need to build to defend yourself, but if you do build, it could be seen as a threat, which could provoke a response. But on the other hand, if a state doesn't arm itself, it risks being vulnerable. This can lead to arms races, as each state sees a defensive move as a threat and builds, which leads the first state to build more, and so on. These races also have the added complexity of gaining an advantage with ever more sophisticated weapons. We will now look at the effects of this competition in the international community. The first thing to point out is the huge amounts of money that states are willing to spend on their military. Many of the world's problems could be easily solved if this money went to other areas.
The United States spent more than $609 billion on the military in 2014, which is more than double their nearest rival, China. This clearly gives America the greatest capability and is a huge advantage over every other country. But as we have seen in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, this does not always guarantee success. We will cover non-conventional weapons of warfare and terrorism later. First, though, let us turn to more conventional weapons. Recently, there have been huge leaps in military technology. We now have drones and precision-guided munitions. These are sometimes referred to as smart bombs. They have several advantages. First, they are relatively accurate. This means that civilian casualties can be reduced, which makes them more likely to be used. Unfortunately, as we have seen, sometimes in the news, this does not take into account human error, which can lead to casualties, because these weapons are extremely deadly. Another advantage is that they would reduce the risk on the force that is using them, as a drone, for example, can be flown by pilots hundreds of miles away. This again makes them more likely to be used. A large con is that such weapons are extremely expensive. Cyber warfare is another field that is still largely unknown to the general public, but with an increasing reliance upon computers and technology in every area of life, it has been made far more viable. What started out as a way of stealing secrets has developed into a way to bring down a country's economy. What's more, unlike high-tech weapons, cyber warfare is far more affordable and can be done by almost anyone, including terrorist groups. Now let us move on to weapons of mass destruction. Nuclear weapons especially change the game dramatically. With the advent of nuclear weapons, countries are now able to destroy all life on Earth. Defense against them is nearly impossible, so the world has turned to focus much more on deterrence. But there are other types of WMDs. There are in fact 5 different types. 1. Nuclear weapons. 2. Chemical weapons. 3. Biological weapons. 4. Radiological weapons. These are weapons made out of radioactive material, which are highly poisonous, but only rely upon a regular explosion. And we also have 5. Electromagnetic pulse, or EMP weapons, a large electrical explosion that are used to damage electrical circuits. Chemical and biological weapons can be popular options because they are much easier and cheaper to produce. They are also easier to hide. What truly makes any of these effective for defense purposes is the ability to deliver them. Long-range missiles have become incredibly important. You may have seen on the news a series of tests that North Korea have had for medium to long-range missiles. For nuclear weapons, the greatest concern is proliferation. Since America first invented them, there's been a fight between keeping them a secret and countries looking to acquire them. So far, 9 countries have nuclear weapons. It has been suggested that more countries have nuclear weapons is not a bad thing, because it will mean that more countries will have the ultimate deterrent, but they will never actually use them, as they know they would be wiped out forever if they did. This argument can be disputed on the grounds that perhaps not all leaders are rational and therefore could use them regardless of the consequences. So far, we've looked at weapons of traditional warfare. Now let us turn to look at terrorism, insurgency, and guerrilla warfare. Now, insurgency is the attempt to overthrow the political power in a territory through violence, while guerrilla warfare is the use of ambush and harassment tactics instead of direct conflict in order to complete an objective. Both of these tactics are perceived negatively in the media, but from a neutral perspective, they are simply attempts to achieve their success given severe limitations. Theoretically, they obey the same rules outlined for more traditional tactics. Users of these tactics are looking to minimize their weaknesses while maximizing their opponent's weaknesses. Generally, they look at the funding and the manpower to do anything else. Conflicts that involve the use of these tactics have grown as more conflicts today include non-state actors against much larger, more powerful states. These are known as asymmetric conflicts. These tactics have proven successful in places like Afghanistan against Russia in the 80s or during the Korean War. Finally, for today, let us turn to the controversial topic of terrorism. The birth of cross-border terrorism by well-funded and well-organized non-state actors is one of the greatest concerns for international relations and has caused many to reconsider their traditional views on power. The first issue that must be held is, what do we mean by terrorism? It has become a very emotionally charged word, and it tends to be tossed around a lot, and depending on your point of view, one group could be a terrorist or a freedom fighter. For this class, we shall define it as use or threat of force by non-governmental actors to change government policies by creating fear of further violence. This is not the only possible definition, but it does stress three key points which we shall unpack now. The first, the violence is the method and not the goal. This means that there is a political point to the violence. This also means that the definition can be applied to many different groups regardless of political affiliation. This separates it from murder or organized crime. This violence must be carried out by non-state actors. While governments can use similar tactics, especially if that government is weak, like in Syria today, this would still not be considered terrorism. The targets of the violence will most often be civilian targets, but they are not really the target at all. It is really about the broader society and government. If anyone can be hit at any time, it is far more likely to spread the fear. They are seeking to achieve political effects far greater than the amount of violence used. This definition, though, is still not perfect, and does mean that there can be disagreement over certain groups. ISIS at the moment appears to have tried to form their own government within a territory. This could mean that they are no longer considered a terrorist organization. Their political message and outsider status, though, could still mean that they still are. From this definition, it is clear that terrorists will have two distinct advantages in their asymmetric conflict. Firstly, as terrorists do not control states and therefore people, they have little if nothing of value that can be threatened. Secondly, as terrorists can choose when and where they want to attack, while states can find it difficult to locate terrorists, which means the conflict will often take place on their terms. But what about the causes of terrorism? This is a very important question, because if we can identify the cause, it could be stopped before it starts. The first explanation is that of rational choice. If an actor is facing an opponent with vastly more capabilities, then terrorism could become the only viable option. An example of this would be the IRA against the British in Ireland after World War I, who were able to force the British Army to leave the country using terrorist tactics. Another explanation is poverty. Poverty is viewed by some as inherent to the world economic system. This can create a sense of desperation and alienation for huge numbers of people. Terrorists usually come from very poor countries and are fighting very wealthy ones. These young men may simply have nothing else to live for. But if we consider the number of very poor people in the world compared to the number of terrorists, this link is indirect at best. Perhaps it is best at explaining the circumstances in which terrorist soldiers are recruited from. If we want to reduce the strength of a terrorist group, we could help and lift up the community from which they draw up their recruits. A third explanation of terrorism is religion. This can be a very obvious explanation because of the obvious religious agenda of some recent terrorist groups. Looking back in history, at radical Catholic and Protestant groups, one could say that religious extremism of any kind could contribute because it fosters the idea that only you are right, and therefore God will justify any action to achieve your goal. The use of violence by Muslims is by some considered more likely because of the more violent ideas in the Quran. This makes the followers of Islam more prone to terrorism. I would suggest, though, caution when using this explanation. While there are some Islamic terrorist groups that teach these philosophies, the vast majority do not agree and would absolutely disagree with their principles. An example of this would be the killing of innocents, which the Quran forbids. The terrorist groups represent a tiny fraction of the religious population. Furthermore, as suggested earlier, this use of religious texts to support violence is not unique to Islam. Christian crusaders made very similar claims. It wasn't considered a sin to kill a Muslim. Speaking of other groups, there are several who have used suicide attacks who are not particularly religious. So finally, similar to poverty, religion is widely spread, but terrorism is very rare. It must therefore be considered an oversimplification that religion, and specifically Islam, causes terrorism. Religious grievances can be a powerful source of unrest. On its own, it cannot be considered a sufficient explanation. As both of these answers are insufficient, the question has begun to shift towards who becomes a terrorist. This is an attempt to find a psychological model of a terrorist so we can determine threats. This work is still ongoing. In conclusion, though we can say that the set of grievances is large, and that very few people choose to resort to terrorism, and in rational terms it is only undertaken when all other options have failed or will fail. Next week we will be tackling the problem of global inequality.